We're going to talk today about Augustine and Baldwin, and particularly, we're going to examine religious conversion and spiritual autobiography and the philosophical relevance of autobiography. And we will look at two people in particular, Augustine and Baldwin. One was African, relatively wealthy, middle class, Roman, living in the mid 5th century AD in the crumbling Roman Empire. And the other was African American, a novelist, a playwright, and an activist, born in 1924, died in 1987, born in a disadvantaged home in Harlem and confronted with systemic racism. What I'm interested in is their spiritual autobiographies have quite some differences and similarities. Let's look at how they are similar and how they are different. Now, thinking about conversion and how it happens, like how do you settle on a given religious belief? You usually have something from childhood. It could be either just no religious belief at all, or it could be any sort of religious belief that your parents impart to you. Conversion is once you decide to settle on something, or deconversion when you decide that the religion that you had from childhood is not really what you wanted, is not a purely cerebral matter. And we know this actually since the 1950s and 60s, since sociologists such as Rodney Stark have investigated how conversion happens. And Stark was particularly interested in the rise of Mormonism in the Latter-day Saints movement in the United States. And he was interested in how come on the face of it, there are very strange elements to the LDS Church, so they are definitely different from mainstream Christianity. How come they are so popular? And one of the things he noticed was that there is a social element to conversion. So it is something you have to look at the social benefit. It's not the case that people are going to make lists, or normally not. There might be some people who do so, of all sorts of plus and minuses and rational arguments for or against. Rather, they look at the social dimension. And when people convert, often they will say, for example, how Jesus gives them joy, not so much about all sorts of arguments. And this has given rise to what is called in sociology the Loveland Stark model. Now, this model has received a lot of attention, but it's also been criticized because they have been people who have criticized this model say that it's purely about social factors, and that's clearly not the case either. It's both. People have both social factors, sort of like who are the people around you and what do they believe, and that's important. And there's also non-social factors involved. And people do reflect on whether they convert, deconvert, when they make such decisions. So, this is where philosophy of religion can really be of relevance and interest. Now, I will link to a recent study by the Pew Forum that shows that a lack of religious affiliation is on the rise, particularly among young Americans, entitled in the US, The Decline of Christianity Continues at a Rapid Pace. And they were surprised because the Pew Forum has been basically investigating young people's religious beliefs and actually general population. And they made all sorts of predictions of what Zoomers and millennials would be believing. And in fact, the de-Christianization in the United States is going at a more speedy pace than they had predicted. So you could think about that, like, why is that? Why is that? And that was before the pandemic, because ever since the pandemic, number of churches that have been permanently closed, number of people who are not going to church anymore and have no intention of returning has increased. Now, I think it's interesting to just look at these individual factors and also look at philosophers who have tried to explicate and make clear to us the ways in which they make such decisions. This ties in with the class on Monday, where we looked at the idea of philosophy as a cool, disinterested, which doesn't mean disengaged, but it means a sort of view from above, a view that is detached and dispassionate, and how Desert Phillips and Wittgenstein have favored such a view. And then we've wondered, like, is it even possible to do so? And so now I want you to look at two authors who are clearly not disinterested because they both really have a stake in the religious views that they are discussing. But they nevertheless do this with a certain detachment that I think is interesting for us to look at. So, first, we'll look at James Arthur Baldwin, a playwright and novelist who grew up in a disadvantaged black household in Harlem. His mother had fled her alcoholic husband and then married Baldwin's stepfather, importantly, a Baptist minister who treated him very harshly. And so this had a huge influence on Baldwin, this stepfather. And as he became a writer and he wrote several long pieces, novels, other texts, he wrote Letter from a Region in My Mind, which is not addressed to anyone in particular. So, unlike his Letter to My Nephew, for example, which is addressed to his nephew. So, when you read this piece, and it is rather long, but I think it reads very smoothly, so you will have no problem reading it. It's just a letter that flows from a region in his mind. And relevant in that is some autobiographical facts, which he states in the letter, namely that he becomes a youth preacher in the Harlem Pentecostal church from the ages of 14 to 16. And as a teenager, he wrote many works already, including poetry. He had to put any college plans on hold to help provide for his 7 younger siblings. His father died in 1943, and so he took odd jobs to support his siblings' mother and to work at his writing at the same time. Then he had a breakthrough fellowship that allowed him to live in Paris. And as I've also found, having moved around quite a bit, and Baldwin also expressed, says when you move, you get a different perspective on things. Once I found myself on the other side of the ocean, I see where I came from very clearly. I am the grandson of a slave, he writes, and I am a writer. I must deal with both. He also wrote several novels dealing with homosexuality, which, he had many relationships with men, but he didn't want any labels. So, for example, Giovanni's Room is a novel that deals with homosexuality, written in 1958. But his essays on the lives of black people in the United States would win the biggest acclaim. And as you see in the linked video, it brought certainly attention to him from the CIA, who were wondering about this. So when you read The Letter from a Region in My Mind, one thing to keep in mind also is that it was later bundled together with another essay and then published as The Fire Next Time, which made him really famous and landed him on the cover of Time magazine. And just a few things to note. You will see this in the letter, but just to point your attention to it, he shows how he falls away from the church because he felt that it was a expression of his full experience of humanity. He recounts his dinner with Elijah Muhammad when Muhammad educates Baldwin on the Nation of Islam in the hopes of him to join that movement. And in that section, Baldwin describes how black Muslims have made a black god in order to avoid the oppression of a white god that Christianity would have established within the black community. So Baldwin died on December 1st, 1987, at his home in France, in Saint-Paul-de-Vence. He got a Légion d'honneur. And so, even so, he is politically very important and relevant to the civil rights movement. He didn't want to be a spokesperson or a leader. He just saw his personal mission as bearing witness to the truth. And in fact, he did accomplish this mission, is generally acknowledged, through his extensive, rapturous literary legacy. So have a look at The Letter from Region in My Mind and try to think about what Baldwin thinks about religion and how he engages with it, how the autobiographical and reason interact with each other. So the second sample of writing that I have provided for you is Augustine, and it's all elements from Confessions. Now, in the meantime, I know that if you are a student at SLU, you will have read Confessions, you will have read parts of it, which will make it easier because you can then just very quickly go over it and just remind yourself what it was all about. So just to very briefly recap, Augustine was a middle class African Roman. He grew up in Tagaste at the end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire had fallen to pieces, overrun by Vandals. And he was an exceptionally bright young child, so his parents hoped for great things for him. And they put himself through huge expenses they could barely afford to pay an education for him in Carthage and other places. His father, Patricius, adhered to the classical Roman religion with its many gods and its offerings on altars, home altars, but his mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. Ethnically, they were Berber, which is a northern African population, but culturally, they were entirely Roman. They only ever spoke Latin in the house. So, if you read Confessions, and it's beautifully written, it's written in Augustine's mother tongue, Latin. And there are many versions, like the Loeb version. That's the one actually that I'm using, even though it's a bit of an old fashioned translation. You can easily go online and find the original Latin online easily. Now, Augustine, as you know, is a saint in the Catholic Church and regarded as one of the greatest theologians. And he writes in a very clear, crisp, accessible prose. Like there's no needless contortions, and it's very beautiful as well. Now, the Confessions is a curious piece of spiritual autobiography. And one of the reasons that I think it still resounds is that Augustine makes no attempt at all to sugarcoat things, and that he speaks very, very earnestly about, for example, the grief that he feels at a friend who dies, his struggle with sexuality, and him keeping a mistress, his struggle with sin, with his family, with conflicting sort of attractions and tensions he felt towards, keeping his family and his religious calling, and also his disappointment with Manichaeism. So for 9 years he was a Manichaean, and he got to that faith when he went to Carthage, which you have to imagine like a huge cosmopolitan city, something like New York or San Francisco, or something that equivalent. And he just got really attracted to Manichaeism. And Manichaeism is an interesting religion. So it has basically two gods. It was started by the prophet Mani, who lived in Persia around 200 AD. It preached this dualism. You have the god of light and the god of dark, and you have prophets. Now, Mani, the prophet Mani, thought or believed that the Old Testament was no longer valid because, after all, there's the New Testament, and that one replaces the old one. The world is an eternal struggle between, in Mani's view, bad. And bad is equated to the material. So the material is bad, and the good is equated to the immaterial. And then you have, within Manichaeism, which was a complicated religion with many different levels, you have the hearers. And the hearers were encouraged not to have children, because after all, reproduction, you just put more bodies, more material beings on the earth, which is bad, but to strive instead for an ascetic lifestyle. And there were also vegans, or at the very least vegetarians. And then you had a level even up, which were the elect. The elect were supposed to abstain from sex completely, and they had to adhere to this really, really super ascetic lifestyle. Now, Augustine never was an elect, but he was a hearer, and he preached Manichaeism with gusto. So why did Augustine lose his Manichaean beliefs? And there's several reasons. He became unimpressed by the objections of the Manichaeans against Christianity. So one of the objections of the Manichaeans is, look, there are many contradictions between the Old Testament and the New Testament. But Augustine argued, no, this is not the case. There aren't these objections. These aren't these contradictions. He also became just unimpressed by some celebrated Manichaean leaders and preachers, such as Faustus. And this is in the reading sample. Faustus had a great rhetorical talent, and when Augustine was struggling with his faith and hoped that, Faustus is going to just put it all right, he was just so deeply unimpressed. He thought, well, this man has a lot of rhetorical talent, but has no answers. And then there's all these other factors, probably the influence of his mother, who kept on praying that he should become a Christian, of his friends, all sorts of lingering worries about Manichaeism.